Welcome to Sleepy Histories. Tonight, we'll journey into the quiet details of the past, how ancient armies moved, endured, and survived, all without breaking your rest. If you enjoy these stories, you can support the channel simply by subscribing. It helps us bring you more peaceful journeys like this one. And if you'd like, let us know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always comforting to see our little nighttime community gathering across the world. Now, settle in. Let the past unfold gently. Take a deep breath. And let's begin. In the long ago days, before the roads were paved, before the engines and the steel canisters and the rail cars, soldiers moved by foot. They marched slowly, in lines or loose columns, across valleys, through forests, over ridge lines, into distant and unfamiliar lands. And wherever they went, they needed food. Grain for the men, fodder for the horses, clean water, sometimes wine, oil, salt, maybe a little meat or dried fish if they were lucky. Each of these items had weight, bulk, fragility, and an army on the move might have thousands of mouths to feed. Imagine a small Roman force, perhaps 6,000 or 7,000 men, marching through a quiet landscape in Gaul. They carry spears and shields, yes, but they also carry sacks, cloaks, pans, tools. They are not just warriors. They are walking kitchens, walking caravans. Behind them, pack animals, mules most often, sometimes oxen, occasionally carts if the terrain allows. But many roads are no more than paths, and wheels sink in mud. The great problem of logistics in ancient times was that armies consumed more than they could carry. Food spoiled, water spilled, and beasts of burden ate too. The more donkeys you brought to carry grain, the more grain you needed to feed the donkeys. And so, clever commanders found ways to cheat time. They divided their loads across men and animals. They sent scouts ahead to identify rivers, towns, and fields, and most of all, they foraged. Foraging was not always violent, though it could be. Sometimes it was arranged in advance. Local farmers were paid, though not always well, to sell grain or livestock to the marching troops. Sometimes they gave it willingly, hoping to avoid worse. Other times, the army simply took what it needed. A field of ripe wheat, golden and nodding under the breeze, could be stripped in a day. Villagers might watch from the tree line as their stores were loaded onto foreign mules. But this method had its limits. A region could be emptied in a week, and in harsh winters or in scorched lands, there was little to take. So some armies planned carefully. The Persians, with their vast empire, built way stations. The Romans constructed roads and granaries. The Chinese dynasties of the Han and Tang eras arranged entire bureaucracies to oversee the movement of millet and rice. Still, it was never perfect. Campaigns were often timed with the harvest. An army would not march far in the spring, but might press forward in late summer when granaries were full and carts could be loaded with new grain. They had to move slowly. At most, 15 miles a day, often less. And if they moved too quickly, too recklessly, they could outrun their supplies. Then hunger would follow. There are many tales, quiet ones, of armies that simply faded. Not defeated by spears or arrows, but by thousands, and the need became immense. Rivers were relied upon, and wells. But in dry country they had to carry water in skins or jars, heavy, fragile, and precious. Salt, too, was vital. It preserved meat, maintained health. Salt was often stored in small pouches, doled out carefully. In some armies it was considered part of a soldier's pay. And firewood. Often forgotten, but always needed. Without fire there was no cooking. And without cooking, even the grain became hard to chew, hard to digest. Each night the army camped, and each night soldiers built fires. They cooked, they rested, and in the morning, they moved again. Some commanders became famous for their logistical skill. Alexander of Macedon learned from the Persians. He carried little at times, moving fast, trusting in the abundance of the land. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it did not. The Romans, famously methodical, carried more. They built supply lines, fortified camps, dug wells, stored grain in pits lined with clay and ash. They moved like a slow machine, grinding across Europe and North Africa. In later centuries, armies grew larger, and so did their needs. Napoleon marched with immense baggage trains, but he too outran them at times. In the snows of Russia, it was hunger, not just bullets, that drove his men to despair. Even in the quiet, peaceful marches, the burden was constant. A soldier carried not only weapons, but rations. A few days' supply on his back, maybe hardtack, maybe dried beans, often coarse bread, tough as leather. He chewed it slowly. He dreamed of stews and roasted meat. And he marched. When the rain came, the bread grew soggy. When the sun beat down, the wine turned sour. And still, they marched. It is a quiet thing to imagine. Not the clash of battle, but the slow daily rhythm of survival. Wake, walk, eat, watch the sky, unpack, build fire, cook, sleep. It is not glorious, but it is the true shape of war. Long moments of waiting, of walking, of wondering when the next meal will come. And in that rhythm, so old, so steady, one might hear a lullaby, a gentle reminder that even in the greatest conflicts, men still needed dinner, still needed someone to carry the beans. Armies did not live in one place. They moved. And when they moved, the real challenges began. It is one thing to feed a camp that stays put, a quiet ring of tents, fires burning low, a single well, a nearby market, a path back to the city. But the moment that camp is broken, the moment the soldiers sling their packs and begin to walk, the whole rhythm must change. The grain must move too, the firewood, the water, the oil and salt and wine. The animals must be fed while walking. The carts must stay balanced on uneven tracks, and the soldiers must arrive at the next camp before nightfall, or sleep under the open sky. They did not walk alone. A marching army was rarely just fighters. There were servants, laborers, muleteers, cooks, engineers. Sometimes families followed, wives, children, even merchants. This slow, sprawling collection of people and beasts was called a baggage train. Picture it. Hundreds of pack animals laden with supplies. Wagons rattling slowly, axles creaking. Soldiers marching in long rows, boots dusty, eyes scanning the horizon. Smoke rising in the distance from the next camp. The line might stretch for miles, and all along it, things could go wrong. A wheel might snap, A mule might stumble. A soldier might fall ill. A river might rise. A narrow road might turn to deep mud. If the column was too tightly packed, the rear would stop and start, wasting time. If it was too spread out, messengers might take hours to run from front to back. And every delay meant more food consumed, more water spilled, more time exposed. Commanders had to be careful. They organized the line deliberately. Engineers and scouts ahead, soldiers in the middle, supplies and baggage toward the rear. Cavalry rode at the flanks. Sometimes they sent men ahead to prepare a camp, to dig trenches, mark out the tent rows, build cook fires, find fresh water. At night, when the army arrived, the camp sprang up like a little city, organized, familiar, protected. But it all depended on timing. If they arrived late, there would be no fires, no tents, just the dark. In rough terrain, the line moved even slower. Mountains, swamps, thick forests, all these slowed the march. In snow, men slipped. In rain, wagons bogged down. In heat, animals collapsed. The pace was measured in miles per day, maybe 10, maybe 15, if the roads were good and the weather fair, and even then, only if they left early and did not linger. An army could not outrun its own belly. If it marched too fast, it risked leaving the baggage behind. If it marched too slow, it risked enemy attack. Some roads helped. The Romans built stone roads that lasted for centuries, but most armies marched on dirt, or no road at all. In some seasons they traveled by boat. Rivers and coastlines made for faster, easier transport. Supplies could be loaded onto barges. Soldiers rowed or walked along the shore. But boats required docks, pilots, calm waters, and when storms came, the army had to wait. In some places, donkeys were used. In others, oxen. In dry lands, camels. But every animal needed rest, and every animal ate. Even clever commanders could not escape these rules. Alexander the Great, moving through Persia, had to slow his pace to match his supplies. Caesar, marching through Gaul, sometimes burned crops to deny them to his enemies, but that also meant less for his own men. Napoleon's armies were slowed not by muskets, but by mud and snow and hunger. Even in the best planned marches there were accidents. A cart might tip on a stone bridge, a soldier might drop a cask of oil, a river might flood and wash away a pontoon. And then, all would wait. It is hard to imagine, in an age of airplanes and trucks, how slow war once was, how quiet. The army would rise before the sun, eat a little bread, roll their blankets, sling their packs, and then walk. For hours, across dry fields, through thick woods, along high ridges. Sometimes they sang, sometimes they marched in silence, and when they arrived, they cooked, they ate, and they slept. It was not glorious, but it was constant. A drumbeat of motion, always towards some goal, some border, some city yet unseen. To lead such a column required patience, and calm, and planning. To follow it required endurance, and to supply it, that was the greatest burden of all. Not all armies wandered alone. Some were guided by the quiet hands of a state. Behind the soldiers were roads,
Depots, storehouses, ledgers, officials, grain counters, tacksmen, and behind them farmers, shepherds, millers, boatmen, all of them part of the long, invisible thread that held the army upright. In the great empires of the past, war was not just a contest of arms. It was a question of coordination. The Romans understood this. So did the Persians, and the dynasties of China. Each built systems, not just to fight, but to feed the fight. The Persians built the Royal Road, a long ribbon of stone and dust that wound through the empire. Along it were way stations, places to change horses, rest, or send messages. Couriers could cross the entire road in just over a week. Alongside them, supplies moved slowly. Grain, water, cloth, iron, all bound for garrisons or border camps. The Romans did the same. Roads radiated from Rome like spokes on a wheel. At intervals, mansiones, lodging stations, offered rest and resupply. Milestones marked distances. Maps were carved or copied by hand. Grain was gathered from the provinces, Africa, Sicily, Gaul, and stored in great warehouses. Horea, they were called. Thick-walled, cool, and dry. In winter, when fields slept, the grain slept too. In jars, in bins, in deep pits lined with ash or clay. When the army marched, carts were loaded, mules fitted with harness, men given rations for the road. But even the best system could be strained. Floods destroyed bridges. Taxes failed to arrive. Corruption crept in. A governor skimmed too much. A merchant lied about weights. So there were inspectors, census takers, quartermasters. Their job was to count and verify, to watch, to write. Sometimes they marched with the army. Sometimes they waited behind, tallying what had been used. In China, these roles were even more formal. In the Han dynasty, entire ministries were devoted to granaries and salt. In the Tang, edicts described how many pardan of grain a soldier required, how many oxen were needed for 1,000 men, how much hay for the cavalry. Bureaucrats were trained to manage supply, to predict, to order, to request more. Yet even with plans and schedules, much remained uncertain. Rain delayed harvests, locusts came, roads washed out, rebellions flared. And still, the army moved. To prevent collapse, some rulers built redundancy. Extra granaries, stockpiles hidden deep in cities, forts along key crossings, watchtowers with signals to request aid. But others relied on improvisation. They made alliances with locals, bartered in markets, requisitioned what they lacked. Some armies even lived off the land. By design, not as foragers, but as predators, taking what they needed, when they needed it. A harsh practice, but sometimes the only option. Meanwhile, in the capital, officials traced lines on maps, colored in roads, sent scrolls by courier. They might never see the battlefield, but their numbers, their estimates, their orders could change everything. A single missed shipment might starve a legion. A miscounted barrel might leave horses thirsty. And so these quiet workers became part of the war too, not with sword or spear, but with ink and wax and care. It is easy to forget them, but the soldier does not. He knows who filled his pouch with grain, who repaired his boots, who ensured his pay arrived. He might curse them when it does not, but he remembers. The empire depended on this balance, of men in the field and men at the desk, of roads and records, of carts and ciphers. Even temples played a role. Some stored grain for lean times. Others managed land whose harvest was taxed to fund war. War was not just fought. It was supported. And every camp, every march, every victory was paid for in advance. Not in blood, but in planning. Behind every army, 1,000 hands, most of them unseen, but all of them necessary. Armies moved not only through space, but through time. Time shaped the path as much as rivers and roads. The seasons were not just a backdrop to war. They were its rhythm, its limits, its invisible walls. In winter, the world slowed. The ground hardened. The nights stretched long. Fires burned lower. Food grew scarcer. Soldiers needed thicker cloaks. Mules stumbled on icy trails. Water froze in barrels. Bread became harder to bake. And so most armies paused. They camped. They wintered. They waited. Some near cities where supplies could be brought in. Others in fortified camps with trenches, walls, and stockpiled grain. This pause was called winter quarters. Here, soldiers repaired equipment, cleaned weapons, dug latrines. Sometimes they trained. Sometimes they simply endured. For generals, winter was a time of planning. They reviewed maps, heard reports, wrote letters, and when spring came, they marched again. Spring meant softer roads, open markets, rivers high enough for boats, but not yet wild with meltwater. It meant fresh crops soon. Lambs, milk, green forage for horses. Spring was the season of beginnings. Marches began in April. Battles in May. By summer, the fields had been planted. Farmers were free, for better or worse, to be drafted, to serve, to carry loads, to fight. But summer had its own trials. Heat, dust, storms, insects. In some lands, summer brought disease. Malaria, dysentery. Men weakened by heat and long marches grew sick more easily. In others, it brought thirst. Wells dried, rivers shrank. Casks had to be hauled further and further from clean sources. And yet, it was also the time of decision. Sieges were started in summer. Armies pushed deep into enemy lands. Supply wagons rolled over dry roads. But they could not roll forever, for autumn loomed. In autumn the days grew shorter, the nights colder, and the crops, those precious crops, were finally ready. This was harvest season, and here logistics became a question of timing. A commander could take the harvest for his army, but that meant leaving the land bare for winter, starving civilians, angering locals, possibly ruining his own future supply lines. Or he could leave it and risk it being used by his enemy. Some chose to burn what they could not carry. Fields blackened, barns collapsed. Wind blew ash across the hills. Autumn was the edge of the knife. Push too far, and winter would trap you. Retreat too soon, and the campaign would fail. Many ancient campaigns ended not in battle, but in withdrawal. Retreat before the passes froze, before the mountain snow closed, before the boats could not sail. Every region had its window. In Gaul, mud closed the roads by November. In Mesopotamia, spring floods made travel risky. In Central Asia, sandstorms blew up without warning. A clever general knew the calendar as well as the map. He knew the phases of the moon, the tilt of the sun. He watched the clouds, listened to local guides. He counted not just days, but supplies per day. How many pounds of grain were left? How many barrels of water? How much time until the first frost? And still, surprises came. An early snow, a late storm, a hotter than expected summer. These small changes could ripple through a campaign like cracks through glass. Even a single cold snap might freeze an army in place. So they moved with caution. They left markers on trails, sent scouts ahead to check rivers, dug drainage for camps, gathered firewood in advance. They learned to read the land. And still, the land sometimes won. More than one army disappeared in the snow, lost to ice and silence. Horses fell. Carts sank. Men slept beside fires and never woke. No amount of training or courage could change the turning of the world. And so the best commanders respected the seasons. They timed their marches like farmers timed their planting. They fought in windows, and they ended before those windows closed, because the seasons always returned. But not every army did. When an army could not break a city with force, it surrounded it. This was the siege. Not a clash of swords, but a waiting game. A test of supply, of patience, of time. To besiege a city meant to remain still for weeks, sometimes months. The soldiers built earthworks, dug trenches, raised palisades. They watched, waited. Sometimes they shouted to the walls. Sometimes they sang. Sometimes they did nothing. And all the while, they had to eat. A siege army was like a camp stretched thin around a circle. The enemy at its center. The fields behind, if they were lucky. Nothing at all, if they were not. They could not forage too far. The defenders might strike. Raiders might burn supply wagons, so they had to plan carefully. They built fortified camps near rivers. They dug wells. They stockpiled grain in advance. Sometimes they brought animals with them, pigs, chickens, oxen for hauling. Sometimes they relied on ships, sailing up rivers or hugging the coast, delivering sacks of wheat, bundles of hay, barrels of oil. But weather could delay those ships. Enemy fleets could attack them. A single sunken barge might mean hunger for hundreds. And so siege armies had to live carefully. They rationed. They cooked in common. They posted guards on the food stores. In some campaigns, the besiegers starved before the besieged. Inside the city, things were not easier. The gates were shut. The markets closed. The fields abandoned. Whatever food lay within the walls on the day the siege began was all there would be. Grain, salted meat, dried fruit, wine, olives, hard cheese, water from wells or cisterns, if they had them. Sometimes secret tunnels let water in, or brave swimmers, or a hidden postern gate. But often there was no relief. The defenders rationed. They baked flatbread from old grain. They boiled leather for broth. They dug up cellar stores and counted every jar. Sometimes they sent out messengers by night, over the walls, under cover of rain or fog. These riders slipped past enemy lines, hoping to summon help. But until that help came, they waited. The people inside grew thinner. Faces hollowed, bread grew smaller, firewood ran low, nights grew colder. Still they endured. A city could hold out for weeks, sometimes for months, even years. The besiegers tried to hurry the end. They built towers, threw stones, fired flaming arrows, dug tunnels under the walls, and still the defenders held, because to lose the siege was to lose everything. When food ran out, the choice became stark: surrender or die. But the besiegers had their own fears. If the siege dragged too long, their own supplies might run low, morale might falter, disease might spread. The longer they stayed in one place, the more vulnerable they became. Insects bred in the latrines. Rats swarmed the tents. Dysentery crept through the ranks. Sometimes the rain did not stop. Sometimes the wind never quieted. And the men grew tired. So sieges became not just struggles of strength, but of endurance. Which side could last longer? Which side had planned better? Occasionally, a siege ended suddenly. A wall collapsed in a storm. A gate was left ajar. A traitor opened a postern door. A tunnel reached its mark. But more often, it ended slowly. A white flag, a horn call, a parley at the gates. The defenders came out, thin, ragged, blinking at the sun. Sometimes they were spared, sometimes not. And the siege was over. But in the quiet afterward, the soldiers still remembered how they had lived, how carefully they had eaten, how cold the nights were, how long the days felt, with the city always in sight. A siege left its mark, not just in broken walls and burned roofs, but in memory. And in every future campaign, commanders asked, if we besiege, can we last? Because to siege a city was not just to fight its walls, it was to fight time itself. No army marched in silence. Orders had to be given, directions followed, plans changed, and yet there were no radios, no satellites, no phones humming quietly in every pocket. Instead, there were runners, riders, torches, horns, flags, ink on parchment, shouting across fields, whispers in tents. In ancient campaigns, communication was itself a kind of battle. Every morning someone had to decide who goes where, with what supplies, how fast, on which road. The answer could not be shouted down the line. It had to be passed, hand to hand, voice to ear. In some armies, this was the job of messengers. Trusted men, quick of foot or skilled on horseback. They carried small scrolls or memorized the words. They ran across camps, along muddy roads, between commanders. Sometimes the message was simple. March at dawn. Wait for orders. The left flank has moved. Sometimes it was urgent. Reinforcements needed. Enemy spotted. Retreat. They ran through heat and rain, over hills and bridges, often alone. But alone, they were vulnerable. A single wrong turn, a twisted ankle, a delayed ferry. And the message never arrived. So some armies developed systems. The Romans had signal towers. On high hills they lit fires, waved flags, raised arms in patterns. The Greeks used torches, held in combinations like a kind of ancient code. A message spelled not in letters, but in light. In China, smoke signals rose from beacon towers spaced along the Great Wall. In a single day, warning of invasion could cross hundreds of miles. But even when the warning was heard, there was no instant response, because information moved no faster than a man could run, or a horse could gallop, and horses grew tired. A good messenger might cover 50 miles in a day, maybe more with fresh mounts at way stations. But even the fastest rider could not beat the sun. And so armies planned with delay in mind. They gave orders in advance, contingency plans. If this, then that. If the enemy moves west, send the second column north. If no news arrives by dusk, begin the fallback. The more disciplined the army, the more effective these plans became. The legions of Rome moved like a machine, because each man knew his place. But even Rome had its miscommunications. A delay in orders, a misread signal, a commander acting too soon or too late. And when armies grew larger, the problem only multiplied. How do you command 20,000 men across 5 miles of uneven ground? Some used horns, others drums. Notes were sounded to begin the march, to signal rest, to warn of danger. But these signals had to be heard. A strong wind could carry a drumbeat away. A fog could hide a signal flag. The cry of animals could drown a horn. So armies moved carefully. They stayed in visual contact. Officers relayed orders up and down the line. Flags waved from the front. Hands pointed. Riders galloped from tent to tent. Even in battle, messages moved. A general on a hill might send orders to a cohort in the valley below. The messenger had to find the right unit, the right officer, and deliver the message, amid noise, dust, shouting, and blood. Some never arrived, and so trust was placed not only in systems, but in people. In commanders who could act on intent, not just instruction. In lieutenants who knew the broader plan. In soldiers trained to respond, even if the message was late. Because in war, delays were deadly. A missed signal could mean a missed ambush. A delayed retreat could mean encirclement. A wrong turn could lead a supply train into enemy hands. And yet, communication still happened. Somehow, in the chaos of motion, messages moved, like threads through cloth, stitching together the moving parts. When it worked, it seemed seamless. A column turned. A camp was built. A battle line reformed. But behind each success were dozens of messengers. Flag bearers, signalers, scribal hands and steady riders. Their names often lost to history. But their work, it was the glue. Because an army is not just force. It is form. And form needs words. Every army marched not only with men, but with things. Armor, weapons, boots, tents, cooking pots, nails, rope, cloaks, needles. And every one of those things could break. A sword dulled, a sandal split, a cart lost a wheel, a tent pole snapped in wind. And still the army had to move. Because there were no supply drones, no overnight shipments, no plastic buckles or spare parts sealed in plastic. There was only what they brought with them, or what they could make. So ancient armies learned to carry not just tools of war, but tools of maintenance. A legion might bring with it a forge, an anvil, bellows, iron bars for reshaping spearheads, leather for patching saddles. The Greeks brought whetstones for sharpening. The Romans brought files, clamps, pitch, even lime for waterproofing. In every camp, there were men who could sew, mend, bind, carve. A soldier might fight in the morning and spend the afternoon fixing a harness. A camp follower might wash woolen cloaks. A blacksmith might shoe horses under torchlight. Because without tools in good condition, the army could not function. A dull blade was dangerous. A cracked shield failed when most needed. A worn cart could scatter grain on the trail. So care became constant, not glamorous, not heroic, but essential. Boots had to be checked. Often. Soles worn thin after miles of marching across gravel and stone. In the Roman army, each soldier carried spare nails, hobnails, to fix his sandals. When they ran out, they pulled old ones from abandoned shoes. The leather of those sandals stretched and dried with every mile. They were oiled, wrapped in cloth, restitched with care. Even tents required upkeep. Made of hide or rough cloth, they sagged in the rain, tore in wind, molded in damp valleys. Each night, soldiers hammered stakes, tied knots, smoothed edges, and when something tore, they repaired it with what they had. There were no replacements waiting in the next town. The next town might be empty or hostile. So armies traveled like moving villages, with artisans, smiths, cooks, leather workers, carpenters. A spear shaft cracked in battle. It could be replaced, if there was wood, if there was time. A bowstring snapped in the rain. Twisted gut, soaked and stretched, was ready in a pouch. And when there was no time, soldiers improvised. A plank cut from a barn became a shield. A belt became a sling. A cooking pot served as a helmet, at least for a moment. In siege, maintenance became even more urgent. Engines, ballista, onagers, siege towers broke down in use. Axles warped, ropes frayed, pulleys snapped. And there were no mechanics to call, only the men who built them, now asked to rebuild them, again and again. Every morning brought inspection. Is the blade sharp? Is the strap secure? Has the mold crept into the grain store? Have the horseshoes held? When the answer was yes, they marched. When the answer was no, they worked. Maintenance was not a pause in war. It was part of it. And even rest days weren't truly rest. They were days to wash, to stitch, to patch, to tighten the yoke, to mend the tent flap, to scrape the rust from the iron tip. In peacetime, civilians might fix a saddle once a year. A soldier might do it twice in a week, and still things failed. So they grew accustomed to that too, to riding with worn reins, to cooking in dented pots, to wrapping their feet in cloth when sandals failed. The army endured because its tools endured, and the tools endured because someone quietly took care of them. That care was rarely sung about. It did not win battles, but it prevented defeat. In every history, there are names that rise to the top. Generals, kings, emperors, dates carved in marble, victories remembered in song. But behind every one of them were wagons. Wagons creaking over stones, carrying sacks of grain, bundles of arrows, coils of rope. Behind every banner was a cart, and a man walking beside it. No battle was won on courage alone. No empire ruled by sword alone, because soldiers, like anyone, must eat, must drink, must rest, must mend. And so behind every triumph was a line of tired men and animals plodding along a dusty road. They had no songs, but they were the reason the army could march at all. And that is the strange shape of history, that it is often made not by moments of brilliance, but by consistency, by a wheel that didn't break, by a message that arrived in time, by a mule that didn't stumble crossing a stream. And while the names of kings survive, the names of quartermasters usually do not. But their work remains. In the structure of supply routes, the layout of forts, the patterns of roads that once fed an army and now feed cities. Even now, highways follow old paths once carved by marching men. Cities bloom at river crossings once guarded by camps. The logistics of war became the geography of peace. And in that way, these quiet systems outlasted the armies they once served. A well-built granary outlived the general who ordered it. A road paved with care outlasted the war it supplied. Because while war ends, the need for movement does not. And so we walk their paths, sometimes without knowing. We take the same curves in the road, cross the same valleys, rest beside the same rivers. We do not hear the creak of wooden wheels, but the echoes are there, in the quiet under the trees, in the shape of the hillside trail, in the bones beneath the soil. Every empire, in the end, is a logistics problem. And so the story of history is also the story of motion. Grain shipped to garrisons, oil carried in clay jars, water drawn from wells at dawn, letters written by candlelight and handed to tired messengers, boots worn through and mended with care, horses fed before men, barrels hoisted by rope and by hand. None of it glorious, all of it essential. So when we tell stories of conquest, of resistance, of change, we should remember it was not only banners that won the day, but carts and wheels, and the quiet, constant effort of those who kept them turning, and perhaps somewhere they still do.